which case you don't need me to worry about it.
Thank you.
So this is IT security in a virtualized world, and it kind of came about for a couple of reasons. One being we've got big enough here that we have an IT security department. So to step back, I've been in Nautel, this is my 35th year. And when I started here, our network was two PCs. It was an 8086 and an 8088, both running Lantastic and connected with a piece of RG213. You know, we had one computer in our Bangor facility, and we used a 2400 baud Roadrunner modem to do an incremental update of the Clipper Summer 87 database that our then service manager and now owner wrote, which was our whole, that was our whole system. IT security in those days was primarily limited to not letting anybody who didn't know how to run the computer touch the computer, and that was the whole deal. Nowadays, it's a much, much bigger deal. Um, for what it's worth, malware was actually down last year, but it's still into the tens. Like oh, and I've heard reports anywhere between 23 and $50 billion was the size of the malware industry last year. You know, billion here, billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. It adds up fast. I tell folks anymore, it's not a matter of if you get hit with ransomware or malware, it's when and how hard it is to recover. So, and it can be anybody. I mean, the lower right, although the headline's talking about WMNF, the article mostly references KQED down in San Francisco. KQED, when they got hit in 2016, it says 17 there, but I'm pretty sure it was 16. I could be wrong. Anyway, when they got hit, they estimated that it took them close to 3 years to fully recover to the tune of $1 million and change. It's not inexpensive to get back from a fully loaded malware attack. By the way, I do have the chat window open in front of me too, so if anybody's got any questions, you can either bellow out and interrupt, or just have Kent or Chris or Everett can type directly into the chat. I'm good either way, it doesn't matter. But it's just one of those things that, so I learned a couple of things. So I'll give you another example. There's a group in Wisconsin that got hit. Lake Geneva, Wisconsin is a thriving metropolis of a couple of thousand people. It's a summertime community about an hour outside of Milwaukee. And little singleton radio station there with just a little FM, Class A. They were doing everything right. They did their backups, incremental backups daily, fairly full backup every week, differential backup every week. Anyway, they're doing it right, removing the media, taking it home for the weekend, so it's even off-site for physical security. Except one weekend, they had just done a major import of new content into their automation system, so their record library, their database of music was taking a lot longer to back up, and whoever was doing the backup had a meeting or an appointment or a hot date of some kind. So they said, well, I'll just grab the removable hard drive on Monday morning and we'll deal with it then. They come in Monday morning and every computer in the place had a bright red screen on it. So they ended up getting hit with crypto locker to begin with. And I say to begin with because I learned something else from that story too. When number one, it used to be that any malware you got as the result of somebody actually accessing your equipment was some script kiddie sitting in his mom's basement with nothing better to do than hack around on the internet and see what he could find. Now it's more likely to be a server farm running AI processes to basically search everything there is over and over. And I'll give you some examples of how bad it is these days. But so in this case, what had happened, that this one server hit it, found their a way into their machine, accessing a vulnerability, it dutifully encrypted everything on the hard drives, and then sold all that data to somebody else in the industry, the malware industry, who promptly encrypted it again and then sold it to somebody else who promptly encrypted it again. So they ended up with 3 layers of nested encryption, which of course had to be deconstructed or decrypted in exact reverse order, because you can't just apply your decryption key to somebody else's encryption. And they ended up hiring an IT security company to go in, one that specializes in malware recovery and ransomware attacks. And they hired a company to negotiate with and I'm going to flat out call them terrorists, because that's, in my mind, what they are. But with the ransomware folks, and they got the final tally down with somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 it cost them. Now, for a little singleton Class A in a small summertime community, that is a big chunk of the budget. So that's the kind of thing that we're paying attention to more and more. So I said I'd show some ideas of activity. What you're looking at, the left-hand side of the screen, is an Eero mesh network, and it's reporting active port scans detected over a 1-week period. So 280,000 port scans, 1,863 active intrusion attempts that were blocked. By the way, that's my home network from last fall. For reference, that 1,863, you break it down, look in the lower right section of the screen, and you see that my wife's laptop was the primary culprit. It turns out she was playing an online game that she'd found somewhere that ended up being hosted on a Russian server. So needless to say, she doesn't play that game anymore, and our threat block numbers are looking a lot better. Our scans, last week's report had me at 560,000 port scans. So you remember way, way back in the day, and again, not quite back to the 2 computers with Lantastic, but going quite a ways back. In the early days of internet, our answer was we slap a router at one end, and then we'd port forward everything. They just assign an obscure port. That's not a solution anymore. I mean, when I'm getting hit 500,000 times a week at home, that's on average 80,000 scans a day, every day, all day. So, it's no point in assigning something to an obscure port, because these days there's no such thing as an obscure port. By the way, this is me being cocky. That top right corner that was last October. It may have changed since then. I do rotate my IP address every now and again at home. But that was my home IP address. And if you hit it with Shodan, you find nothing. And that's kind of my key to this whole thing. We used to say security through obscurity by going with Linux or something that nobody had ever heard of then. And now it's just, how well do you firewall? If people can't find any devices on your network, then they're much, much less inclined to try and hack it. You're not going to hack something you don't know exists. Here's the challenge, and you're going to see this Shodan logo a lot. By the way, it's shodan.io, shodan.io. If you're not familiar with it, it is an amazing resource for network security. And from a manufacturer perspective, it's a great resource for figuring out how much of your stuff people have got unprotected on the internet. And so I ran through a couple of different broadcast names. I mean, you've got, obviously you can see Nautel there in the center on the left. I did put Gates Air in there just for grins, Worldcast, and, Barracks. So Barracks, of course, one of the more popular low-end STLs, IP STLs. 1,434 visible on the internet when I ran that scan. It'll vary by a couple of hundred day to day, because, of course, they get used for a lot of remotes. They get plugged in and unplugged. But I've never seen it less than 1,000. I've seen it as high as 2,500 during like a big sports weekend, which may or may not have just happened. So this is the kind of thing that's it's really scary. Because when you think about it, up until 2017, the default username and password on a barracks unit was nothing at all. They didn't have one. They've added since then, and they've done a great job of it. But if you've got one running that pre-2017 firmware, then when you plug it into the internet, anybody has the IP address has access to it. And I can tell you that there are a pile of them out there. Now, side note, it's okay to access your own equipment. Like if you see your own gear listed on a Shodan report and access it, but accessing somebody else's stuff is highly not recommended, and there may be legal aspects to it. Now, I do it as sort of a, they call it a Nautel service. I check in every couple of weeks to a month. And when I see something like this, there's 4 Nautel transmitters I was able to access. And again, default usernames. So I did go through and I make it a routine. When I find them, I've blocked out the call signs and anything that would identify them. But I'll send out an email and say, hey, you need to fix this. By the way, the bottom one is mine. It's my VX600 that I had configured as a backup at my station. So that one I put it up for an example, but it's not probably not going to be seen at the moment because it's currently in a box in my office. But yeah, there's a pile of them. Okay, TP-Link router. And I mean, that's a pretty common router. And I put this up for 2 reasons. The big reason is to show that, number one, I was able to find it on the internet. And it's really easy to go into a router and lock down everything connected to it. So again, if you can see it, it's a target. It shouldn't be there. Okay, there's a Barracks STL that, again, one from our station, so I didn't mind showing it, but it was just plugged into the internet and logged into with the default. Well, again, it's an older one. There was no default. There is now. So in this case, I was searching for Nautel, and I found an IP address with a bunch of open ports, so I started checking each of the ports to see what was there. Well, I found one of our transmitters running the Legacy AUI Access app. I found the Barracks encoder, I found an Innovonics 732 RDS encoder, and I found another TP-Link router. At that point, when you think about it, I've got the ability to go in, change your power, change your frequency, I can set your audio source, I can lock it down to whatever IP address I want, I can control whatever displays on the receiver to any car listening to that station, and then I can lock down your network at the transmitter site so you can't get to it. So until somebody physically goes there and unplugs it, that's what everybody's going to be watching or listening to. And that's the thing we need to do better. I mean, it's just terrifying to me. There are several out there where you go to put in the default username and password and you can discover, okay, that's not it's been changed. That's a good first step. You know, I should never, ever, except on a totally closed network, never see a default username and password. So good first step. But again, if I can see it, it becomes, at that point, it's a target for brute force hacking. And a lot of folks will use like KQED1069. Okay, I don't know the frequency. I know they're low end of the band, so I've got it wrong on purpose. But if you're just using an alphanumeric password with like 8 or 9 characters in it, the time to brute force one of those these days is measured in seconds. Okay, it used to be years ago that it would take days to, 8 characters is plenty for a password. But Moore's law works. Computing power doubles pretty much every year. And yeah, it's literally measured in seconds. I mean, a 24-character alphanumeric with no special characters or caps or lower versus lowercase, again, that time is measured. You're up to minutes or even hours. But it's not enough. You need to, unless you have an incredibly complex password, you absolutely need to, and should be anyway, making your stuff as invisible to everybody else as you can. Okay. One other note, and I mentioned virtualized world in the beginning. A lot of folks have seen where Telos is going with a lot of their stuff. They're using Dockers and containers, and it works great. We use some VMware and some of our latest HD gear. And the reason I put those up is because it's important to know the difference between a virtualized machine and a containerized machine. And it's important because the containerized machine, everything on it, every container, every individual application will be sharing the host machine's OS, the host operating system. Whereas in the VM world, in virtual machines, every virtual machine installed on a computer brings its own OS with it. So you might have Linux, Windows, Unix, as I've got shown here, all running on one computer. Our HD multicast runs VMware. It's a Windows computer running Linux exporter in virtualization. The reason that's important is because depending on what you're using for virus protection and malware detection, you may need different definition libraries based on the operating systems in play in your network. So it's important to know what you've got, because if you don't know what you've got, how do you protect it? And I mentioned earlier, like with the security through obscurity, a lot of folks used to say Linux was the solution. 2023, for the first time ever, malware was aimed more at Linux devices than at Windows. 53% of malware detected in 2023 was targeted at Linux. So Linux as its own protection isn't really as valid anymore. You do have a lot more power and flexibility to firewall it in the way you set it up, but just out of the box, if you download Ubuntu and plug it in and turn it on with everything enabled, you've got no more security on that than a Windows box, and in fact, a tiny hair less. So that's something important. The Apple machines, the iOS machines, and I'm the anti-iPhone guy, but the iOS machines are a lower malware rate. Lower does not mean none. It's about half of Windows or Linux. Half is definitely not none. So again, you need to protect this stuff. Okay. This is just an example. Like it used to be years ago, we did everything with pieces of hardware and physical wires. And so there wasn't, unless you connected it to the internet, a lot of compromisation. But these days with virtualization, we put all of that stuff right into the transmitter. So now I've got one IP address controls them all, so to speak. The challenge becomes as we do this, we need to map it. We need to document it. Now, obviously, you buy a transmitter with all this stuff in it, it's going to have schematics and block diagrams for the transmitter. But if you're plugging that in to your network, do you show the transmitter on your network maps? Do you even have a network map? These are the kind of things that historically, I mean, when we wired up a studio or a transmitter site, you draw a block diagram of what was in the building and what was connected where. And, you know, sometimes there'd be cable numbering charts, depending on how detailed you wanted to get. The challenge becomes when we're talking virtualization, one computer may actually be hosting 4 computers. So you need to have a way to document that. And you'll notice that I show the URL for pretty much every picture I've got because there's some decent source. In this case, eDrawMax is a decent network mapping tool. Some people just like to keep it basic. Rhode Island Public Radio uses Excel spreadsheets to map their network. And I mean, Aaron Reed was their director of engineering at the time this was created. He's just showing the subdomains and physical IPs and locations for each device on his network. And you know, it's a little kludgy, but it's also a lot easier to edit and maintain. At Nautel, we use a Visio type of diagramming system. So this is one page out of, I think Greg's up to a whole bunch, but anyway, it's a page of our network map. So how you do it is totally up to you, but make sure you document it. There are some cool, and I go back to Aaron Reed at Rhode Island Public Radio, or well, he's left there recently, but you might still find this blog there. You'd have to go look. He wrote down a lot of good ideas on organizing and mapping the network, sort of the things he learned as he did them. So any kind of resource is useful like that. And I've got a few others as we go along. The reason that this stuff is important is, and I stole this slide from Wayne Pacina at SBE for a part of his IT security presentation. But he breaks it down like a castle, and you've got different layers of security as you get to the middle. And in a way, that's kind of the different steps that we need to look at. And the biggest one, by far the biggest one, and I mentioned this early on just in passing that I was talking about hardware security and network security. The biggest thing, bar none, more than anything that you can do for IT security is education. Okay, for reference, in 2024, 80, I think it was 82, it was 80 something percent of all malware and ransomware attacks were the result of human error, call it. I call it don't click that link, dummy. Um, so for reference at Nautel, our IT department actually has a policy. They go out and they send phishing emails internally on a regular basis. Spoofed external addresses, occasionally they'll add an attachment that looks like an order. They're pretty good at making them look fairly realistic. But there'll usually be one or two tells in it. Like if you hover over an email address, it'll show you a different resolve to a different source than what the from address actually says. Or there'll be a spelling mistake, or the attachment will have some kind of Ginchy name. And their whole entire goal is to get you to either open the attachment or click the link. And when you do, you get a big red banner on your screen that says, "Congratulations, you've just won the chance to watch this awesome PowerPoint presentation on Don't Click That Link, Dummy." I may or may not be a two-time graduate of that particular PowerPoint, so hopefully I'm learning, and you're getting the benefit of the experience here. But yeah, it's one of those things that 80% of the issues you have will be because somebody clicked it or didn't click it. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too, a little more. But it comes back to the OSI model, the 7 layers, and everybody's heard about like layer 2 this or a layer 3 switch and stuff like that. And that is talking specifically to the OSI model. So whether like physical structure is the number 1 layer, and it's not really even part of the network, except it is, because if somebody can get up to your computer and start rattling on the keys, it doesn't matter what you got for security at that point. Layer 1's already breached. As you go into it, layers 1, 2, and 3 are the ones that are mostly what we deal with in our physical networks as we're configuring things. Layer 4, you're getting into VPNs, and that's important, and that's the thing we want to do. But we're not going to typically write our own VPN. I mean, you're going to either buy a hardware device, which these days could be any router on the planet. That cheap TP-Link router I showed earlier, the one slide 2 or 3, has a built-in VPN hardware. I mean, it's one of those things that gives you end-to-end encryption. There's no reason not to do it in most cases. Well, the biggest reason not to do it is because they're inconvenient. And that's something else that we'll beat the drum on a lot. Oh, this one, by the way, just shows that if some guy with a sledgehammer shows up, it isn't going to help much. But the big thing with the VPNs and the convenience is, and this is my general mantra, the easier it is to use, the easier it is to hack. And that's it in a nutshell. If it is like, and I described this for Seattle yesterday, but when I fire up this laptop in the morning, the laptop that I'm running this presentation on, the very first thing that'll happen when I open it, it'll power up and it will ask me for a 6-digit passcode. And that's the crypto key, the BitLocker passcode to actually decrypt my hard drive. Until that's entered, absolutely nothing's happening on this computer. Now, once I do that, it'll start running through the boot process, and then it asks for the 1620, something like that, character passcode that I've got assigned to this computer. IT makes us change that on a regular basis. There's arguments for and against changing passwords. My argument is if you get a good, long, secure passphrase using letters, characters, numbers, and upper lower case, then the time it would take to force that is measured in years, and that computer will probably be long gone before then. But having said that, if you're more of the use your daughter's birth date type of password person, then changing it and cycling it through everybody's birth date might be a good idea. Oh, pro tip, don't use birth dates as a password. Also, don't use password as a password or admin. Or 1234 or 12345. That's my luggage combination, by the way. Just don't do that. It's right up there with default usernames and passwords. So pick phrases, something you can remember fairly easily. I like to use my wife's name, but I pick her middle name, which she refuses to use in public anywhere, so it only shows up on her birth certificate, and I change different letters for different numbers. So, as an example. But find something that's easy for you to remember and hard for other people to find with a brute force. It's got to have letters, numbers, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, all that great stuff. Okay. So this is another one of Wayne's slides, and these are the 10 things that he says you should do, and then the top 10 things. And I go 2 steps further because for me, VPN is absolutely a requirement. I mean, I give you a prime example. So I was in Minnesota not too long ago. I was visiting a buddy there who is a little bit of he is a lot of a mad scientist and kind of a hacker extraordinaire. And we're just sitting in his living room one night, kind of messing on our cell phones. And he goes, "You're in your bank." And I go, "How do you know?" He's got cell service packet sniffing software running on a laptop with an SDR attached to it, just pulling the radio waves out to see if he could see what I was doing on my phone. And he was able to get enough out of it to know that I was in RBC. So it's like, okay, so I'm not using my cell phone to do my banking unless it's through a VPN anymore. Just running over the cell network, not as secure as you might think it is some days. It's, what do they say? It's not paranoia if they really are out to get you. So absolutely, I like the VPN. I mean, on my personal devices, I've got a software VPN called TunnelBear. It's remote hosted, so you are putting some trust in the VPN company to have some level of security. Odds are their security is probably better than the network at Casa de Welton, so we'll roll with that. But again, it's a judgment call. A lot of folks like hardware VPNs where you've got physical boxes at each end, and that's fine too. Pros and cons to both, but use some level of encryption, and the VPN's the best way to roll with that. Educate, educate, educate. Everybody in the facility that uses a computer needs to have some level of awareness training, I guess. How to spot the nasty grams and what to look for. And above all, here's an example. So if any of y'all sent me an email with an attachment, and I know Brian Walker up at BSW is going to be sending me one tomorrow. We had a phone call today, so he told me he was sending it. So when I get an email from Brian tomorrow with an attachment, I'll probably just click on it. If I got an email from Brian tomorrow with an attachment and we hadn't already had that phone call, I'd be picking up the phone and calling Brian and saying, "Hey, did you just send me an email with an attachment?" In-house, if I get an email from anybody in our facility with an attachment, the very first thing I do is open Teams chat and say, "Did you send this?" "Yeah, cool," click. It adds an extra 30 seconds to a minute to the process, plus the time for them to answer. But it's, again, that whole 80% of things caused by people clicking stuff. If you don't just blindly click the stuff and you verify first, that's important. For reference, again, 2024 data, 95%, 90 plus, more than 90% of the traffic on the public internet in 2024 was malware, phishing type stuff, communications. It was not the actual internet traffic, like me typing Google search on where to find the best socks for my wife. That takes up less than 5% of actual internet traffic anymore. Okay, the garbage has outranked the useful information by a factor of over 10 to 1. So, I mean, the useful information's still out there, but just be very, very aware. Again, it's not paranoia if they are out to get you. Here's one example of a day in the life of a Nautel sales guy who's used to clicking on stuff without paying attention. You'll get something like this. We've gone full zero trust. Now, you know what they say about laws. Laws get introduced because somebody did something stupid. Well, zero trust in our place got introduced for the same reason. I'll tell the story in a bit. But so zero trust basically means nobody has access to anything until it's proven they need it. In a radio station or a TV station, you typically wouldn't have the front office receptionist with full access to traffic and billing. You know, sales probably doesn't have access to engineering. Maybe they do, and well, it depends on the sales guy. But again, access is granted as it's required. Used to be years ago, Windows, earlier iterations of Windows, if you set up a new user, they were automatically configured with admin privileges. They've gone the other way with it now, and that's a good thing. Give you an example. So at Nautel now, if I wanted to run an update to the Stream Deck that I use for hosting my TTTs, then in order to run the update to Stream Deck, and I picked that one because there is an update out for Stream Deck right now, I've got to open an IT service ticket. I've got to tell them what I want. I've got to tell them where the software comes from. They will go on a secure machine, verify the software, and then they will come back to my machine, log in through TeamViewer. I'll give them the credentials when we do the login, and they'll go in and download the software onto my machine as a remote user, install it, and verify it works, and then they'll step back out of my machine, and away we go. And this is how we do. The people who are tasked with keeping the network secure are the only ones allowed to install software. And that's, again, now we do a lot of stuff that requires a fairly high level of security, stuff that various multiple letter organizations prefer that we don't let out in the wild, so we maybe go a little overboard. But it never hurts. I mean, you know, when they are out to get you, it's a good idea not to be too visible. By the same token, remember back in the day, and I mentioned this earlier, port forwarding was the answer. And that's not a viable solution anymore. Port forwarding, I mean, all it gains you is a matter of seconds when somebody's found your IP address. So I talked about Shodan earlier. And Shodan has, not to be a shill for them because we're not affiliated, but they've got multiple levels of user account. Like you can just go shodan.io, type something, and they'll give you a page of results. They'll tell you how many total results. You only see the first page. You can set up a free user account that'll let you see all the results and access IP addresses to see what's there. At that point, you can also scan IP ranges. So that's what I use to scan my home network. Then you can go to levels of paid account all the way up to we will physically go into your network and see what's broken, like do intrusion testing for you. So, you know, again, there are multiple places offering that kind of service. Shodan I like because it gives me a quick and easy way to just see what's visible out there. And if you want to scare the pants off somebody, show them 1,400 unprotected barracks boxes. Okay. By the way, Lucidchart, I've got that link down there just because Lucidchart is another awesome, it's good for doing flow charts or network maps. And I picked it for that reason. The free version only lets you do 100 elements, which work great for this drawing. But you can go to subscription versions where you can do all the way up to, like I say, the level of our network map. This one's just giving an example of somebody who's got a firewall at their studio, but the public internet between the two transmitter sites, AM to FM, there's no protection at all. And a lot of folks will put a VPN up like that, where they're protecting at one end, but not doing end to end. You need full end to end protection with the firewalls and the encryption. Okay, now again, whether you do that with a hardware device or a software device, that's really up to you. But you need to have that level of protection and encryption. And again, one more beating the drum, and I say I've got so many different pictures, but partitioning, comes back to the zero trust principle. I mean, the automation computer should not necessarily be talking to the public internet. Now, yesterday somebody was mentioning that one of the things they do is, or yesterday might have been a day or two. Anyway, I've done about 4 webinars this week, so it's all starting to fuzz together. But they were talking about how the automation computer never goes on the public internet. And in some facilities that may be feasible. In others, where you may be having a smaller 1 or 2 people show, then it may be that you kind of have to do some show prep on the same computer. You might use dual NIC to separate them in that case, so the network and the internet don't theoretically touch. You can use split tunnel VPN. I'm not a fan of those because you're basically poking security holes, but some security is better than nothing in most cases. Uh, Definitely, as much as you can, partition everything. So it comes back to the whole zero trust principle. Again, I don't need access to whatever finance is doing upstairs. I guarantee you they don't want me to have access to that stuff. So just use a lot of caution when you're setting that stuff up. Just a brief description there, just talking about like a software VPN versus a hardware one and the pros and cons of each. And I'm not going to read the wall of text, but as I said, we'll make sure you get a copy of the recording of this. If anybody wants a PDF of the physical slide deck, certainly shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to send that out as well. And I know Kent's got my email address. I'm pretty sure Everett does. And I think, Chris, you can probably find me on the internet somewhere. I don't know. I'm not that easy to track down, but there you go. So I talked earlier about education, and I've beaten it over and over and over. And the reason we beat it so much, this is a typical day in my email. Okay, top left is your standard phishing email. I mean, and this is what I call quote unquote old phishing email. This is from about 2 or 3 years ago. You see some spelling errors, some poor grammar, some general things that make you look like this is not a legitimate email. Okay. The top right is a little more current, a little more urgent, and it shows to come. The from address on that was it@nautel.com, which is in-house a legitimate address, but the plus side for anybody that actually works here, nobody actually uses that address internally. So, that was the first giveaway there. Hovering over keep my password and seeing russiangirls4u.net or whatever it was, I don't remember. That was my second clue that things were not exactly as they should be. Okay, lower right-hand corner, I still get those ones. I can promise you nobody is trying to fax me anything anymore. And haven't for several years. Lower left is the reason that we are now a zero trust facility. Somebody in the engineering department had found something on CNET's download website where they had just a little Windows app type file that helped them do something they were doing with sorting or parsing data. I don't know the details, didn't ask, don't care. Whatever it was, they downloaded it and it worked wonderfully for about 8 months until the Trojan launched. Okay, it was just a Trojan, it was just malware, it wasn't, anything too serious. We're a Sophos protected facility, and Sophos shut their computer down and disassociated from the network so fast they didn't even know they'd been connected. They ended up picking up their cell phone and calling IT to complain. Well, of course, IT's sitting there with a big red banner on their screen saying, somebody click this link, dummy. And they say, yeah, we know you're disconnected. You need to come into the office. Here's why, here's how. And oh, by the way, nobody installs anything on any machine ever again unless it's us. So, that's, like I say, you learn the lesson by letting the horse out of the barn at least once. But that is the kind of thing that you really need to get used to doing, because more and more, this is what's going to happen. Okay, and it's always the most innocuous. Big buzzword for the last year, and what is probably going to be the biggest topic of conversation at this year's NAB show, AI. The thing AI does best It writes perfectly crafted emails so that you no longer know whether it's a phishing email or legitimate, and it can spoof a from address so good that you just can't tell. Okay, and that's what I said. We've gone to a huge trust but verify philosophy. If you send me an attachment and I didn't have a heads up that you were sending me an attachment, I am almost always going to pick up the phone and call you to verify it. Or I'm going to forward the attachment to our IT department who are going to scan it on a safe machine and then call me back and say, yeah, it's okay to click. So yeah, there's a process that happens here. This is just like I said. This was Stephen Poole of Crawford down in Birmingham, Alabama, was mentioning all of the different patches on Linux these days as Linux becomes more and more a target. And the reason for that's pretty obvious. I mean, when you look at all of the Arduinos and Raspberry Pis and IoT things out there, devices, I've got at any given time probably somewhere between 20 and 40 devices running on my home network, and I'm going to take a quick peek into my network reporting system if I can. There it is. Let's take a really fast course. My teenager is at school right now. I'm here. I currently have 16 devices online in the house. Everything from the refrigerator to the television to the thermostat, Wise camera in the carport, a couple of cell phones, computers, etc., and so on. All of those things run various operating systems. Most of the ones we use at home are running a version of Linux. Okay, and that's important. So the other thing you need to do, and I've got Pi-hole up here just as an example of a network monitor. I don't care what you use. PRTG, Passler, is a good free network monitoring program that you can install on a network machine, and it will take a good solid look at network traffic. Anybody who's used Wireshark, Wireshark gives you an overwhelming amount of data, but it also is the best thing at telling you where the bits are going and where they're coming from. And I use Wireshark just as a point by point by IP address on my network to see what devices are phoning home on a regular basis. And the funny thing is, I don't know if I'm on the camera or not, but cell phone. And I'll rephrase. So two cell phones. I have an iPhone and I have a Samsung Galaxy. And the Samsung phones home every time somebody's speaking within range. It's sending that data, listening for wake words, listening for stuff to feed Mother Google that it can translate into ads. And I've had that talk happen where I was talking with somebody about something, and while we were having the conversation, I'd get a Facebook alert for a marketplace ad for that thing in my neighborhood. So, again, they are listening, and I mean, what do they say? If you're not paying for it, you are the product. Well, that's pretty much true when it comes to on-air marketing too, or on-air marketing, over phone marketing, internet marketing. But they're targeting it as much as they possibly can. That's relatively innocuous. I'm not worried about that getting in and compromising my personal data, so I don't pay a lot of attention to it. My Wise camera is constantly sending recordings of the video it sees back to their offices in China, because that's where they host it, in Shangzhou, I think, but could be wrong there. Doesn't matter. I mean, again, my empty carport is really not a source of data that for anybody wanting to compromise my lifestyle. Same with my thermostat. Nobody cares if my wife turned the temperature up 2 degrees or down 2 degrees, in our ongoing thermostat war. Or my television or refrigerator was open for 30 seconds. I don't panic a lot about that stuff. What I do is make sure that they are not subject to incoming data. Primarily because, well, as an example, before I locked the network at home down, my TV used to have an annoying habit of turning itself on once or twice a week. And we just assumed one of the cats walked across the remote until we had the remote in a box on my wife's desk and there were no cats nearby and it turned on. And it's like, okay, at this point, somebody's found the IP address. So, again, the protection at Casa de Welton got just a little bit tighter. So those are your big ones. I mean, the other thing we didn't really touch on backups, and we're past the top of the hour, pushing the top of the hour. I guess it could be worse. But backups, like transmitters, data, and this is the thing we don't think about. Everybody pretty much does backups these days. You know, you back up the automation, you back up traffic and billing, you back up any network machine that has any kind of critical data on it. And you ideally keep that stuff air gapped so it's not physically connected, because a mirrored backup that is physically connected is just going to be corrupted about half a second after the first one got corrupted. So, you know, connected backups are useless. Air gapped is required. And by the same token, when it comes time to recover, don't just plug your backup media into the computer. Disassociate that computer 100% from the network, reformat it, totally wipe it, and then restore it from the backup. And here's the other challenge. Like with the guy with the Trojan that launched 8 months later, make sure that your backup is actually is clean, isn't contaminated. And that's what I was getting to with this. Backup, as with the transmitter, is only as good as the last time you saw it running. So sure, we all do backups on a regular basis, but how often do you test a backup by trying to restore from it? Pick a sacrificial machine and try to restore to that machine as if you would trying to recover from a malware attempt. Make sure that the backup is clean. That becomes your reference point backup, and ideally you're going to update that every month. And everything I'm talking about, I know adds time, and we don't have time. But I'm here to tell you it takes a whole lot more time to recover from ransomware attack or a malware attack. Um, Easy, chip, reliable, that pick any two, that's been the mantra forever. Doesn't matter whether you're talking cars or computers. And don't poke holes in the firewall. I've had so many situations where, and I'll give an example, we're guilty of it as much as well, yeah and no, we do it voluntarily. But if you've got one of our transmitters with the phone home app in it, if you look on the transmitter, those transmitters will have a checkbox that says click here, or do not click here unless instructed by a Nautel service representative. And that basically is us drilling a hole through your firewall so the service tech can get in and take a look in the transmitter. I've run into a pile of them where that box was checked. There was nobody on the phone to a service tech. So just that kind of thing. Plug the obvious holes. Close every single port that isn't being used. Port 22, prime example. Port 22 is SSH, Secure Socket Handling. And it is, in a Linux machine, the gateway to the kernel. It should not be opened under any circumstances unless you are actively doing kernel maintenance and need to be in there. Okay, otherwise, on all of your devices, whatever firewalls you're using, hardware or software, I don't care, block port 22. Basically block, again, zero trust, block every port you don't need. Like I can tell you on our transmitters, on the older ones, you need port 80, port 343, and port 3501. If you're running SNMP, you need 161 and 162, and that is it. Okay, you don't need anything else. On the newer ones, we use 443 for the AUI instead of 343. But again, find out from your manufacturer what ports you need and lock everything else down. So that's the kind of thing that we need to focus more on, because as I showed earlier with those Shodan scans, it's something we're not doing enough of yet. So that, in a nutshell, that's the whole spiel. I mean, I've got the mandatory resources. I do have a version of this from one of my TTT sessions. TTT is Transmission Talk Tuesday, by the way. It's something they did to keep me out of trouble during COVID. We'd gotten away from it last year because I was just too busy to do them, but we started them up again a couple of weeks ago and did one again yesterday. So hope to see more of those. Those ones I have fun with because they're 100% not Nautel oriented, except I'm wearing the shirt and putting the banner up on the screen when I'm talking. But the actual sessions, I mean, yesterday we were talking about automation systems with DJB. 2-3 weeks ago, we were talking about soldering skills with an engineer from Blanchard River Broadcasting in Columbus, Ohio. You know, so if you've got a topic that you think would be fun to talk about, shoot me an email. See if we can fit it in. It'd be a lot of fun. Right, newsletters, YouTube channel. YouTube channel is kind of cool because we put the customer service how-to videos on there, and that one is, like how to swap out a PA on something that you don't necessarily work on a lot. Sometimes comes in handy. Right. That, in a nutshell, is everything I had. If anybody has any comments or questions, now would be the time, and we'll throw the floor open to them right now.
Anybody got a question or comment or anything?
Want to find out if we can get one of his shirts.
So the fancy button-up shirts are restricted. We do have a pile of T-shirts that we can usually find a way to distribute. Anybody that goes to our users group in Vegas, and I say our users group, we started it out calling it the Nautel users group, the NUG for short. It's now become the NUG Radio Technology Forum because we try to make it, again, not a sales pitch. I mean, Lord knows we're at NAB, you're going to get enough of those as you go. So the whole goal with it is to try to keep it industry specific. But anyway, anybody who signs up and goes to NUG, usually we give a custom T-shirt out for those every year. So we'll see if we can find something. And if Jeff Wilson ever shows up, tell him I said, hey, give us a shirt. We did have a Hawaiian shirt one year that we've been threatening to put up on an Nautel store, so we may have to see if we can talk marketing into breaking that loose too, because that was pretty cool.
Thank you.
So
I've got a question.
Question.
Yeah.
KBOO radio station recently bought a Nautel transmitter.
Uh-huh.
And on the back of the transmitter, I noticed there's this lug that needs to be grounded. And I've been told it's inconsequential,
You've been told what?
that it's inconsequential to ground off that lug on the back of the transmitter.
Who told you that?
I won't say.
Was it a Nautel employee or somebody else?
It was somebody else.
Okay. So basically, that lug is the primary ground point for the transmitter. I'm going to qualify that before I finish saying it. The primary ground point for the transmitter is the coax shield, the flange at the top of the transmitter. And if you were able to look on the inside of that panel, you would see a lug there with two gauge insulated multiflex black wires that go straight down to that insulated lug at the bottom. The reason we use the insulated lug at the bottom is to give us full control to do a single point grounding system within the transmitter, the same thing we preach for transmitter sites. So everything in the transmitter ties back to that output connector ground at some point or another. But my general rule of thumb, if you're cabling high, then run your ground to the output connector and you'll be fine. However, unless you're in some mythical place where lightning never strikes, you absolutely should have a lightning ground to the transmitter. How you get there, that's a little more up to you. That help?
So what is the hazard of not grounding that lug to the transmitter?
So if you don't ground that lug to a proper earth ground, then I'm assuming that you got your coax shield grounded, in which case that output connector becomes your ground point. Now, having said that, if you're running corrugated coax, you're adding a lot of length and a lot of resistance to the ground point between the transmitter and the outside world. So it doesn't become as good a ground as a straight strap to that lug would be. Remember, with lightning protection, we're playing a voltage, or well, technically a current divider game, and every 1/10 of an ohm of resistance, if I've got a 1/10 of an ohm here and 1 ohm here, that's 10-to-1 on the current flow. If I can change that 1/10 of an ohm to 100th of an ohm, that's a 10 times improvement in my lightning protection. And that's why I pick strap over cable, for example. Like a 4-inch strap has got a resistance of about 0.0016 ohms per foot, whereas a 2-gauge cable has a nominal about 0.16 ohms per foot, so 100 times as much resistance. So, little things like that. So the ramifications in not grounding that, if you've got a decent ground to the output connector, are zero. Absolutely no difference at all. If you're relying on a coax shield ground, in Washington State or Portland, the Northeast, not going to be, or Northwest rather, it's not going to be that much of a difference. You guys aren't a high lightning area like, say, Florida. But it does put you at a little more risk. And if you ground the chassis, well, then the risk becomes that while you're leaning against it someday, it gets extremely hot, and that's just a bad thing. So yeah, that's the whole concept behind it. We, like with our IT security, tend to go a little overboard with it, but nobody who's followed anything I've suggested has seen more failures than they did before. So that's typically, what do they say, proof is in the pudding.
Thank you.
Well, I was curious, at one point you were talking about the AI, which is starting to take over the world.
Yep.
And I noticed that every cell phone and into computers wants to write your words for you instead of
Yep.
you doing it and making mistakes on them.
Right. So
So
yeah,
is this,
Gemini AI, for example, on the Samsung is very much likes to do my job for me.
and I agree, I see that happening. But how do we put a stop to the people that are out there trying to maliciously take over our lives?
Oh, you don't. You just ignore it and work around it as much as you possibly can. I mean, at this point, I think that horse is out of the barn.
I think it is too, because there's nobody's going to prosecute them, even if they get caught.
Right. And this is why I come back to what I was saying with the zero trust. Like I say, if I get an email and I am not 100% sure that who sent it, I am absolutely going to pick up the phone and verify.
Best thing to do is just remove it.
Yeah, well, these days you can't live without a computer and you can't get rid of the AI in it. So that is what it is, and all we can do is work with it.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right, I will.